And yeah, I want to say welcome. It's great to have all of you here. And we're really happy that you are joining us today for the State Policy Showcase on state nutrient reduction policies. I'm joined today, my name is April Engel, and I'm the Policy Director at River Network, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Erin Kanzik. And if you have any questions or need anything as we go through today's State Policy Showcase, just feel free to send a message to either Erin or I. And so just to get us started, as I'm sure most of you are well aware, the reason for today's State Policy Showcase is that nutrient pollution is an issue that is negatively impacting communities all across the US. That includes things like toxic algal blooms, dead zones, and poor water quality in our rivers and our lakes, streams, and our coastal areas. These excess nutrients are coming from a variety of sources, including cropland and confined animal feeding operations, lawns and golf courses, municipal and industrial wastewater discharges, and failing septic systems. So according to the EPA, in a recent memo that they released, nutrients are the most widespread stressor impacting our rivers and streams. And EPA reports that 58% of the nation's rivers and streams and about 45% of our lakes have excess levels of phosphorus. They also tell us that about 2/3 of the nation's coastal areas and more than 1/3 of the nation's estuaries are impaired by nutrients. And to begin to address these issues across the country, state policymakers and regulators, they play such an essential and important role in taking steps that we need them to take to address nutrient pollution. So in today's State Policy Showcase, we have with us Evan Isaacson with the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, Doug Myers with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Cindy Skrukrud with the Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council and the Fox River Study Group, who are going to tell us about their state's nutrient reduction policies and strategies. Evan and Doug are going to share with us about Maryland's policies that are driving nutrient reduction progress, a recently passed state bill that is expected to dramatically reduce pollution of all forms reaching Maryland waterways and communities, and tell us about further progress that is also still needed. And then Cindy is going to share with us policy recommendations that can move Illinois' nutrient reduction law strategy forward and the progress that has been made. And then following these case studies, that's when we want to open up our discussion to all of you who are joining us on the call today. We hope that you too will share about the nutrient reduction strategies that you're working on, including the strategies that you're using, the coalitions you're building, and any roadblocks that you may be encountering as well, and what you're doing to overcome those roadblocks. And to begin, what we want to do is really engage with all of you who are with us on the call today. And it's great to see so many of you here with us. We want to ask a few questions and hear more about what you're dealing with where you are working. And so we're going to do what's called a chatterfall. And we're going to ask a question and ask everyone to put their answer in the chat. And then all at the same time, we'll hit send and we'll take a look at what you're working on and what you're dealing with in your state. So the first question that we want to ask you all to answer in the chat, and then when I give the word, we'll all hit enter at the same time, is how are excess nutrients impacting your waters and community? So if everybody could put an answer to that question, how are excess nutrients impacting your waters and or your community? And then here in just a second, we'll all hit enter at the same time and see what we're dealing with all across the attendees here today. So I'll give everyone just a few more seconds to type your answer in the chat. And then on the count of three, let's all hit enter. 1, 2, 3. All right, so some of the answers that we're seeing, there's unfortunately, many people are dealing with toxic algal blooms, We are dealing with drinking water quality impacts, cumulative impacts across the basin, impairments, degraded farm fertility, taste and odor problems in our drinking water. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing what those experiences are. And then the second question we want to ask you all to put in the chat, and we'll use the same process, is what do you hope to learn during today's showcase? So I'll give you all just a few seconds to type your answers in the chat. All right, so on the count of three, we'll all hit enter and we'll see what are some of the things that you're hoping to learn today. 1, 2, 3, and hit enter. Great, thank you all very much. So some of the answers that I'm seeing are different methods in state policy, what's working and what isn't, approaches states are taking to tackle this problem, how advocates are using conditions of receiving waters to drive improvements throughout the upstream watersheds, regional differences between approaches, creative options for North Carolina, where we're dealing with some roadblocks. Hi, Danica, I'm in North Carolina too. So yes, it's great to see your answer there. So yeah, thank you all very much for sharing what you're hoping to get out of the call today, and also the issues that you're dealing with. So with that, we're going to now turn it over to our speakers. Throughout their presentations, please feel free to put any questions that you have for them in the chat, or you're welcome to hold them and feel free, you can ask them verbally when we do the Q&A. We'll have time for Q&A following each of our speakers. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Doug Myers, who is the Maryland Senior Scientist at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Evan Isaacson, who is the Senior Attorney and Director of Research at the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, to tell us about the work that they're doing in Maryland. So Doug, I'll turn it over to you, and then you can then hand it off to Evan when you're ready. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you and welcome everybody. My name is Doug Myers. I'm the Maryland Senior Scientist at Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And I'm going to talk, I just put something in the chat and it's a link to the Maryland Bay Restoration Fund. It is probably the most influential of the policies that were passed in Maryland in order to address nutrient pollution. The Bay Restoration Fund is a flat fee that goes on everybody's water bill in the state of Maryland, whether you're on septic or on city water, you all pay this flat fee. And it goes to capitalize a fund that's administered through the Department of Environment, mostly for wastewater treatment plant upgrades. There's been billions of dollars spent on wastewater treatment plant upgrades to enhance nutrient removal technology, which is going to bring the discharge concentrations down to 3 milligrams per liter nitrogen or less, and 0.3 milligrams per liter of phosphorus or less. Tremendous load reduction has been accomplished through the Bay Restoration Fund. In the later years, after some of the largest wastewater treatment plants were upgraded, the fund rolled over to be able to also help to pay for cover crops. Maryland has one of the most ambitious and well-paying cover crop programs. About $25 million a year goes to that program. And there's also a way for septics to be upgraded mostly for plugging into sewer systems to address failing septic systems. So those were the policies, and I'd say I would call those bright spots in the nutrient reduction game, because we have quantified load reductions that come from those investments. So we can basically look at the cost effectiveness of each of those treatments. We have much less information, much less consistent information about other best management practices. They're highly variable in their effectiveness, and they're highly variable in their cost based on where they're being applied. One of the great I think, advantages Maryland has over some other states as being kind of the center of the Chesapeake Bay um, uh, load reduction activities, both at the federal and the state level, is that the science that went into the Chesapeake Bay model allows folks to really play kind of almost scenario games to figure out how any investment that's made will result in load reductions at the bay. And so there's like a spatially explicit ability for the model to be able to say, okay, this particular BMP reduces this much nitrogen at the edge of the field. But because your field is located 100 miles upstream from the bay, you also have nitrogen attenuation in the river between that field and the bay. And so there's additional load reduction that occurs just because that BMP is being placed on the ground further away from the water. From the bay proper. You have kind of the opposite issue with certain sectors like stormwater, where if you have a heavy rainfall event in Baltimore, it's going to be delivered to the bay instantaneously with no attenuation whatsoever. So it kind of gives a little bit of knowledge to everybody who's out there attempting to apply policies as to what best management practices applied where are going to be the most effective. The way we know progress is happening is that the model itself predicts a load reduction by a progress run. The entire Bay watershed, all 6 states and the District of Columbia, have a land use model that is at a 1 meter resolution and allows for the loading factors from each of those different land uses to be input into the model on an annual basis as land uses change, and loads may go up or down based on what land use changes. And then the best management practices that are applied are all reported in from local governments and state governments to be able to calculate any of the percent reductions that are expected to happen from those BMPs. Now, that's all kind of necessary because a system as large as the Chesapeake, we can't just go out and measure water quality every day to see how things are going. USGS does look at river input monitoring stations across, I think, 10 or 12 major tributaries to the bay, and can calculate decreasing trends in loads across most of those over time, which is really important for us to understand how the landscape is linked to the bay in those load reductions. We're also seeing in the longer term a few things happening. Geochemically, we know that phosphorus is no longer recycling in the bay because we got both phosphorus and nitrogen loads down enough that the dead zone is a mostly dead zone now. It has a little bit of dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the bay, and it allows for phosphorus to be sequestered in the sediments on its way down. So it does not make return trips to drive, more and more and more phytoplankton blooms like it did for a 30-year period. So it's kind of a one-way trip for phosphorus now. That's a huge geochemical change in the bay's chemistry because of the load reductions we've had. And then submerged aquatic vegetation, there's up to 9 or 10 species of that in the upper part of the bay. Very sensitive to light attenuation, both from fine sediment and from the nutrient eutrophication. And there's been lots of ups and downs, but fairly significant regrowth of submerged aquatic vegetation. Probably the largest signal we saw was in the Potomac, just south of the District of Columbia, where one of these large wastewater treatment plant upgrades happened. The Blue Plains plant was able to reduce nitrogen to enough that 30 miles of the river now contains seagrasses, and it didn't for 30 years. So we're kind of excited to see that the blueprint is working, and that when the states do make commitments to lower those nutrient loads, that the system does eventually respond. I have a couple questions that were posed to me for this presentation. What drove those actions? I think in Maryland, it was very clear that we are in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. Everything that all the other states in the watershed do affects Maryland the most. We have the most of our economy and our identity associated with the Bay. And so it's been easier to be able to champion load reduction policies at the state level to a little more difficult degree at the local level. And I think who champions them is, elected officials. They realize that the Bay is important to people on both sides of the aisle. They all have different ways of suggesting policies. Some are more enlightened than others. For the most part, as a scientist, when I go in and give testimony, I'm not laughed out of the hearing room. So people do listen to what we have to say about the science. And advocacy looks like a couple different things. It looks like a science-based position being presented to decision makers. There's a lot of grassroots efforts, a lot of people who care about the Bay who will weigh in and make it a priority for their legislators. And then we will sue people if we have to. Chesapeake Bay Foundation sued EPA in order to bring the blueprint around in the first place. And so you'll hear more of that from Evan, where the judicious application of legal action, and I would say also bringing some of the entities and their actions to the press has been very important, especially in recent years, to say, look, here's what the law says, here's what you're doing. Those two are not in agreement. And so we're going to call that out. And when things get called out in the press, and you have a very vocal constituency saying, what the hell's going on, the decision makers tend to pay attention to that and will do it. So I would say, a couple keys to our success as the Bay Foundation is we base ourselves in science. We have science-based positions. We educate the masses about how the Bay works and what are those things that affect it. And we work with them to make them better advocates, to help them know what to say, how to say it. And we'll organize folks to come to Annapolis and to write to their congressman. We've been able to very successfully get funding applied because it is an estuary of national significance. And we're kind of right on the doorsteps of Washington, D.C. So I'm going to end with that. I'm going to pitch it over to Evan, and I'll certainly be around for Q&A later.
Thanks, Doug. So primarily, I'm going to be talking today about a new bill that was just passed last month that takes effect in about 6 weeks. But to provide some basic background and context, in this area, in the Chesapeake Bay, because of the state federal Chesapeake Bay program and the associated Bay model, all of which sort of support the Bay TMDL itself, most advocates and policymakers and funders in this realm understand the basics of where pollution is coming from. The main source sectors, Doug touched on wastewater, which is one of the big ones. Agriculture is a second one, urban stormwater is a third, septic systems is a fourth. And then another big one that's less appreciated, I suppose, is atmospheric deposition of nitrogen. It's often left off the list because it's not considered controllable by the states and local jurisdictions. EPA handles that through the Clean Air Act. Those are the main source sectors. And for most of the major Bay jurisdictions, each sector has its own policy. Rather than rattle off all of those policies, and Doug touched on probably the most important one, which is the Bay Restoration Fund to upgrade wastewater treatment plants, that drove a substantial amount of progress, certainly in Maryland, but also across the Bay. Virginia has its own analog. It has a major fund that goes to upgrading wastewater treatment plants. And those two laws by themselves have driven a substantial majority of the progress over the last decade and a half in the Chesapeake Bay and reducing nutrients just by funding the upgrade to sort of world-class technology. But what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of an unconventional sector of nutrient pollution reduction potential. Doug's organization, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and my organization, the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, came together with several other organizations 3 or 4 years ago to sort of create an ad hoc coalition of sorts to address what we had been seeing as a major concern in the state of Maryland, but similar concerns elsewhere as well, around a lack of enforcement and accountability. Primarily that affects the point source sector, so wastewater and other point sources of pollution. But it's a problem in all sectors. And I recall, when we were first pitching the idea to funders to help support this new coalition, you had to sort of frame the idea in a context they could understand from a nutrient pollution reduction standpoint. It's not a new sector of pollution, but it is an opportunity to reduce pollution from all sectors. And because we have this model, and because the numbers are so familiar to sophisticated funders as they are for advocates, they kind of wanted to put a number on how much pollution can you reduce by just sort of turning up the dial on enforcement. And I remember having a really hard time with some of the other folks in our coalition trying to put a number on it. But as it turns out, rather unfortunately, we have been able to demonstrate just how much pollution is attributable to a lack of enforcement. At the present time, 2 of the 3 largest individual discharges into the Chesapeake Bay, which are the two wastewater treatment plants that serve all of the Baltimore metropolitan area, they are vastly exceeding their permits. When we first came together as a coalition in 2019, those 2 plants had just been upgraded to sort of world-class nutrient removal technology, and were both discharging around 3 milligrams per liter. Presently, one of them is discharging at 11 milligrams per liter, and this other one at 22.6, which is closer to raw sewage than it is to the world-class level nutrient reduction technology that it was discharging at just 2 or 3 years ago. Consequently, if you look at the Chesapeake Bay program's annual progress data, we now see a dramatic reversal of Maryland's significant progress. And that's entirely attributable to a lack of focus on sort of the nuts and bolts of the Clean Water Act: inspections, enforcement, and permitting. So it was unfortunate demonstration of our hypothesis that a return to the nuts and bolts of the Clean Water Act is in itself a very important nutrient reduction policy. So the new law does 2 things. It addresses 2 major problems that we have here in Maryland. One is that a large number of our wastewater point sources, permit holders in Maryland, are operating under expired permits, right? The Clean Water Act directs that these permits be renewed timely every 5 years. And the theory is, remember, the Clean Water Act is constantly supposed to be driving progress until we fully eliminate pollution. That's what the law says. And in order to get there, you have to constantly renew permits and then incorporate the latest and greatest technology. Well, unfortunately, in Maryland, we have permits that are a decade or 2 decades old, some of which predate the Bay TMDL. They were supposed to have been renewed 2, 3, 4 times over that period, but they're simply not, because the department doesn't have the resources. So the new law prohibits the continuation of these permits beyond their 5-year term with a 1-year grace period at the end of it. They give the department several years to eliminate the backlog of expired and continued permits. And then starting in 2026, they are banned from continuing permits. They have to continually renew them timely and make sure that they are staffing themselves at the appropriate level to do so. The second issue is the lack of enforcement. So the problem is undue discretion for the agency in terms of how often to inspect, whether or not to enforce. The bill simply mandates monthly inspections for every single facility that's in significant noncompliance with their permit. It takes all discretion away from the agency. They just simply have to send out the inspectors every month. And after several monthly inspections, if the facility remains in significant noncompliance, it takes discretion out of the hands of the agency as to whether or not to issue penalties. They just start to accrue. So it is functionally going to ensure that the Clean Water Act, here on its 50th birthday in 2022, we're all celebrating the fact that the bill sort of reinvigorates the Clean Water Act here in Maryland. And as a consequence, from a nutrient reduction standpoint, we're going to see anytime a permit is blowing its limits, whether it's nitrogen or anything else, they will have to come into compliance, or they will start paying penalties. And the department functionally is not going to allow that to happen. You know, penalties are not the ideal consequence. The ideal consequence is the inspector goes out and helps the facility understand why their permit is not being complied with and how to fix it. And so it's very compliance oriented. It's not, you know, a traditional enforcement bill. It's geared specifically to making sure that all facilities are well aware of what problems they have, how to fix them, and it gives them the chance to fix them before they become bigger problems. So it's a very exciting bill that will soon become law. It's going to dramatically increase the resources of the state agency, which has been a significant problem here in Maryland, but I'm also aware that it's a problem in many other states as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has about the bill. You know, I will drop it in, I'll drop a link to it in the chat here so folks can take a look at it, but I would highly recommend a similar approach in any other state, whether it's designed specifically for the purpose of reducing nutrient pollution or any other pollutant issue. And I will also say that it has some pretty important co-benefits with respect to environmental justice, because we have found, no matter where you look, that the violations are most prevalent in those most vulnerable communities. So it will really help drive down pollutant levels in those communities. And with respect to stormwater permits, which it also applies to, if your state has sort of advanced stormwater permitting requirements that require nutrient reduction in the stormwater permit, then driving compliance with those requirements will also help reduce quantity of stormwater, which is, you know, has both environmental justice and climate adaptation related co-benefits. So it's a really powerful bill. It has not yet been implemented, but we're excited to track it and see how it, you know, see what progress it's able to drive.
Well, thank you, Doug and Evan, so much for your overviews. We're going to do a few minutes of question and answer before we turn it over to Cindy. And I saw there's been a couple of questions in the chat that have been somewhat answered, but if anyone wants more information, like Danica, if you want to ask your question again, feel free, or if you have a new question to ask, you can either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask it verbally. Oh, Eleanor is asking, how will those penalty fees be used?
That's a great question. So the state of Maryland already has a dedicated fund. It's called the Clean Water Fund. All penalties go into that fund, and that fund is then used by the department for funding their staff primarily. So it stays with the department.
Well, we have in Illinois brought some direct actions against dischargers under the Clean Water Act, and have had some success with that. I guess my big question hearing the bill and knowing our experiences, it's not normally the wealthiest communities that are violating their permits egregiously. I don't know about Baltimore. I'm a little surprised that they can't continue to operate their plant. But what do you do with the problem of communities that don't have a whole lot of money being asked to spend a lot of money on wastewater treatment?
It's a great question. As Doug mentioned, the Bay Restoration Fund law, and Virginia has a very similar one, raised money for the upgrade of wastewater treatment plants in Maryland. So that law assessed a fee on every household. So there are some equity considerations there, but it also distributed the burden of upgrading these facilities widely across the state. So even though the two largest wastewater treatment plants are in Baltimore City, it collected money statewide for upgrading them. And I will also say that now that all the wastewater treatment plants have been upgraded, that fund is still in place and still collecting money, it's now being dispersed for issues other than enhanced nutrient removal technology at those wastewater treatment plants, including fixing the sorts of problems that these plants are now facing, as well as fixing sanitary sewer overflows, combined sewer overflows, smaller wastewater treatment plants, mainly infrastructure issues. The state of Maryland essentially combines the Bay Restoration Fund state fee revenues with their federal Clean Water Act revolving loan fund revenues, and every year they disperse, $100 to $200 million in water infrastructure grants and loans to the localities. And I would say the majority of that is going to disadvantaged communities.
I'm going to do one more question before we turn it over to Cindy, and then we'll have more time at the end for other questions if we don't get to them right now. Grady asked in the chat, do you have help from certain source sectors keeping other sectors on the hook, or do they mostly fight to keep their own obligations low without pushing on other sectors?
I would say for the most part, when you're talking about sectors, the two sectors that actually have a powerful lobby are agriculture and, to a lesser extent, wastewater. There was some of the intersector wrangling early on in the Bay TMDL process where the point sources realized, if we don't get agriculture and the non-point sources involved, most of the reduction requirements are going to fall on us. So there was a little bit of wrangling between sectors, but for the most part, I haven't seen a ton of it. I don't know, Doug, if you.
Yeah, I just want to, a lot of times because of that tension and the agriculture lobby, I would say nationally, many parts of the Clean Water Act just don't even apply to agriculture, or they're exempted. Maryland is about halfway toward a better solution, I would say. There was mandatory nutrient management plans required to be used on farms, and about 30% of those farms each year are inspected to make sure that they're in compliance with those. If they are not in compliance with the nutrient management plans, those farms will not have access to state agricultural cost share dollars. So there is some pseudo regulation as it pertains to nutrient management, which is pretty important. The nutrient management regulations were upgraded a few years ago to focus in on phosphorus with what's called the phosphorus management tool, realizing that many farms had, because of over application of animal manures, a saturation of phosphorus in the soils. And so anybody who was found to have high risk of phosphorus loss from those fields was required to cease phosphorus application, which also means ceasing the use of animal manure as fertilizer. The state tried to soften the blow on that by investing in a manure transport program, which allows for excess, especially poultry litter, to be transported from areas of high phosphorus saturation to areas of low phosphorus saturation, so that you can spread that nutrient to farms that can use it and not create water quality problems. And then finally, I would say the agriculture sector is a partner in load reductions. There's an awful lot of voluntary compliance with not just nutrient management, but some really cutting edge use of regenerative agriculture techniques to be able to improve soil health and reduce your water quality impacts, while also getting better bottom lines for the farm, and sequestering carbon, and maybe even being able to get carbon offset credits and things like that. So there's I'd say a very progressive set of farmers in Maryland who are pushing the envelope on some of the BMPs, and there are some associations and other groups that are helping to facilitate that. Maryland has an industrial, the Maryland Industrial Partnerships something fund, MIPS grants that also help to invest in like new technologies such as anaerobic digestion and other ways to deal with the nutrient content of manure. So I would say from the standpoint of the ag sector, which is a very large load just because of how much land use is dedicated to agriculture, that there's a lot going on in the ag space in Maryland that we would hope Pennsylvania in particular begins to adopt. There's some legislation pending in Pennsylvania to be able to have a cost share program for the first time in Pennsylvania, which would apply conservation dollars. And if you don't have the state dollars to be able to put in there, the federal dollars from the Farm Bill programs are generally insufficient. And so if you can put state and federal cost share programs together, you can do whole farm planning and really get some serious nutrient reductions. But there still has to be a regulatory component. Maryland does have a law that requires you to fence livestock away from streams. It's for the most part complied with. Pennsylvania actually passed a law a few years ago that prevents you from passing a law that requires you to take your livestock out of streams. So very different outlook on how agriculture should be participating in bay cleanup from the different states in the watershed.
Thank you, Doug. And I'm sorry that we're cramming lots of great speakers in for this 1 hour. So I'm going to turn it over now to Cindy. She's a board member of the Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council, chair on the Fox River Study Group, as well as a retired Clean Water Program Director at the Illinois Sierra Club. So Cindy, I'll hand it over to you. And again, we'll be following this up with more Q&A and some time for discussion.
Hey, I'm here. I'm just trying to move things around on my screen so I can get my slides started. Just a second. Whoop. Whoop. I just lost my slide.
I think if you hit back, Cindy, and then
there we go.
And then, yeah, there you go.
Hold on a second. I got to move. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm happy here to talk a little bit about what I think Illinois has done well on its nutrient strategy and the challenges that we're facing. So after, I would say, about a decade of fits and starts, the Illinois EPA trying to get going on really developing a statewide strategy, finally in 2010, they pulled a lot of stakeholders together and said, we're just going to work together and develop a strategy. And I think that was finally people were ready to be at the table and get to work on something. So we have a strategy that was adopted in 2015, and we release a biannual report every 2 years to report on the progress we're making. And I've got a link there in the slide deck to the page that tells all about our nutrient strategy. One of the good things the strategy does is it set a fairly near-term benchmark. So the strategy set a benchmark in 2025 to achieve a 25% reduction in phosphorus, a 15% reduction in nitrogen, leaving our state. The ultimate goal for Illinois is what it is for other Midwestern states that all drain to the Gulf. It's a 45% reduction in both nitrogen and phosphorus that was set by the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. Another thing that came out of the strategy adoption was all our major wastewater facilities did not in the past, but started having phosphorus limits placed on them. And we're at the point now that, 7 years in, that our wastewater facilities are doing really well. They've achieved a 24% reduction in phosphorus overall and a 10% reduction in nitrogen. So they're definitely going to meet that 2025 benchmark. Unfortunately, we're not doing so well with the other major nutrient producer in Illinois, which is, of course, is agriculture, since we're very much an agricultural state. I think one of the other good things we're doing is we are working to track our progress. Illinois, like in the Chesapeake Bay, is working with the USGS. They have continuous monitoring stations at the rivers that are draining the state. And then we have scientists from the U of I who work on biological assessments as biannual science assessments as part of our reporting every 2 years. So we're tracking water quality, we're looking at that data and charting our progress. One of the other things that allows us to do is to see when things look weird and then put resources into trying to figure out what's going on there. And then lastly, I'd say the other I think good way that we're working on this is we're working on it at the watershed scale. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So what are some of the challenges? One of the things that came out of the strategy is that we pulled together a science expert team who worked for a few years to recommend water quality standards for nutrients for rivers and streams in Illinois. We don't have them right now. That report came out in 2018. They recommended standards for phosphorus, nitrogen, and chlorophyll, but the Illinois EPA hasn't moved forward on that at all. And it's a lot easier when people have a number that's their target that they're trying to meet. We also have not invested what I think we need to be investing to advance our strategy compared to other Midwest states. Unfortunately, both our government and our legislature are really only funding pieces of that are needed to implement this strategy on a year-by-year basis instead of a multi-year plan. We've been trying to get them to commit to 6 years of funding, and they haven't been willing to do that. Well, that's not good for soil and water conservation districts who we need to be technical advisors to farmers. They can't plan to hire somebody if they don't know they're going to have funding, for at least a number of years. And then we haven't been putting a lot of state cost share money into addressing nutrients. We have been increasing the amount of cover crop cost share every year, but it's very minimal. And then lastly, we're facing the challenge of increased storm intensity in the Midwest. Our first biannual report in 2017, we thought looked like we were making progress, but then in our last two reports, we're going backwards. And so my next slide is taken from the 2021 biannual report. You can see that we're comparing our progress to a 1980 to 96 baseline. You look in that top column, flow is up 25% compared to that baseline. You look at the phosphorus increases above the baseline in that time, where our phosphorus loads are up by 35%. And that's despite the fact that wastewater plants have reduced their discharges by 24%. Roughly in Illinois, half our phosphorus comes from ag, half comes from wastewater plants, 4% of the load from urban runoff. In terms of nitrate, 80% comes from ag, most of the rest from wastewater plants. So this is an issue, one of the things that we're trying to understand now, what is driving these increases in nutrient loads, and definitely looks to be tied to river flows. We've heard talks about stream bank erosion contributing to that. So now I'm just going to jump a little bit into what a couple of advocacy success stories. Back in 2012, we established this Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council. It's funded by a fee assessed on fertilizer sales, and that's resulted in $10 million available to this independent council over the last 10 years. It funds research and outreach really targeted at providing farmers with the best information available on what they can be doing to keep their nutrients on their farms going into their crops and out of our waterways. And this was legislation that was developed by the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association together with environmental groups. So I think that's another example of the need for different stakeholders to be working together. Our legislators were like, well, yeah, if both the Fertilizer and Chemical Association and the enviros support it, we can support it. So that was one highlight that we've been able to achieve. The other thing I wanted to talk about are these nutrient assessment and reduction plans. And so without a statewide water quality standard, we kind of were floundering. And so the Illinois EPA worked together again with the environmental groups and the Illinois Association of Wastewater Agencies to basically come up with a kind of a gentleman's agreement of how we are going to move forward to address phosphorus impairments in our watersheds. And so that it requires all major wastewater facilities to work with other stakeholders to develop plans for their watersheds. And as you heard earlier, wastewater plants have NPDES permits. So that's the kind of what you can grab onto to force them to move forward on these things. As part of that, all wastewater facilities, whether they had local water quality problems or not, committed to reduce their phosphorus discharges to 0.5 by 2030 to address not just what's happening locally, but Illinois' contribution to the Gulf. And kind of lastly, I think I've already said this, and I think multi-stakeholder efforts are key, that, we've got to work together because it's going to take the stakeholders at the the only way you're going to achieve this is all the stakeholders are working on their piece of the problem. Other states really get your governor and legislature on board. You heard from the Chesapeake Bay folks how they've done that. I've just listed here what some of the other other commitments by other Midwest states have been. We've been trying to get the Illinois legislature to fund our program at $138 million over 6 years, but we've not been able to get them to do that. And then last, the American Rescue Plan Act sent a lot of money to the state, county, and municipalities. And that money can be used for stormwater infrastructure, addressing non-point source pollution. Funds need to be allocated by the end of 2024, spent by the end of 2026. Here in Illinois, watershed groups like mine are going to our counties and asking for funding to help with non-point source pollution. I know that farm groups in Illinois are are doing that too. So that would, if that's something that you've not looked into in your state, it's a recommendation I've made. So thanks.
Awesome, Cindy. Thank you so much for preparing and sharing that information with us today and all the good work that you are doing in Illinois. So want to open it up for questions that folks might have for Cindy. And Debbie, Deborah, I see that you have your hand up. So yeah, please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Cindy.
Hi, Debbie.
So you're the first one I've ever heard mention chlorophyll standards. And I learned in my aquatic ecology class that the concentration of chlorophyll was very important for understanding the health of an aquatic ecosystem. So I'd like to know what you know about chlorophyll standards.
Well, I can give you a little bit of experience from the watershed that I've been working in for the past 20 years, the Fox River watershed, which is kind of suburban Chicago region. Definitely, chlorophyll is a problem for our waterway, both the chlorophyll that's in the water column, the cystonic chlorophyll, and the chlorophyll that's in the algae that grows on the substrate, benthic chlorophyll. So, those are both critical things. And this, I can share a link. I could probably look at it and maybe put it in the chat. We could send it out later to this recommendations from the Illinois Science Panel, but they recommended both a limit on chlorophyll in the water columns and for the amount of chlorophyll that's held in benthic algae on the bottom of that you see growing on rocks and stuff in streams.
Thank you, Debbie and Cindy. Sandy asked a question, Cindy, in the chat. She wants to know about if the states or if Illinois is tracking the changes in the number of mid and large animal feeding operations and changes in where and how much manure is being is applied and the runoff implications.
Yes, I would say, and Albert Eddings is on here, and Albert's certainly been raising this issue in Illinois. Illinois goes by the faith that these are supposed to be non-discharging facilities, so they aren't discharging. But that is something that we have been raising at the state level, that we need to be looking more into the contributions from CAFOs.
Yeah, in Maryland, the Department of the Environment permits CAFOs through a general permit, and they have a database on their website. So you can go on at any given time and see how many CAFOs there are of different sorts. Almost all of them here in Maryland are poultry operations. As far as manure fate, as Doug mentioned earlier, there is a state program that it's called the Manure Transport Program. If the operation signs up through the state program, they get a subsidy to transport their manure, and what the public gets out of that is transparency. So there's a manifest system tracking where that manure comes from and goes, and who's shipping it, et cetera, et cetera. So, ideally, that program could be expanded up to cover 100% of manure, and then we'd have full transparency into where it's going, because we also have nutrient management plans, as Doug mentioned. So we could see if it was being over applied, or where, if it's being dealt with appropriately. So yes, there's some pretty good transparency here in Maryland as far as CAFOs are concerned. Not 100%, but pretty good.
Thank you, Evan and Cindy, for that. And there's a few comments also in the chat that to check out if you haven't already, and appreciate Danica and Albert for some of the information that you're sharing via the chat. We have about 3 minutes left, and I want to first give a big thank you to Cindy, Doug and Evan for the important work that they're doing and for taking the time out of their busy schedules for sharing it with all of us today. I wish that we had even more time with you today to ask you more questions and to hear from all of you, but that brings me to a quick set of polls that we want to bring up, because what we want to know is, for those of you who are working on nutrient issues in your communities, would you be interested in continuing this conversation? We could invite some of you who are on the call to share the work that you're doing. You could suggest others that you'd like to hear from. And would you be interested in, if River Network were to orchestrate quarterly calls to continue to discussing these issues and hearing case studies? So we'll give you all just a few minutes to weigh in really quickly, and then we want to bring up another poll really quick, just to sort of take the temperature of what your interest might be. Great. Erin, if we could go ahead and open up the next poll. We'll share the results of that one. And then we want to go ahead and then bring up the next poll. And we want to, one other question is, if in addition to quarterly calls, or maybe instead of, would you be interested in an online forum where we could share resources on nutrient reduction, continue discussing these issues, bring questions to each other, share the work that we're doing? And I want to, while you're filling out the poll, want to give a shout out to Albert Ettinger, who, with others who are on this call today, came up with this idea of either online forums or quarterly calls to coordinate with each other during last year's River Rally. And so we would love to just stay in touch with you. And it seems like there is interest. And so that's really great for us to know. So we will follow up with you about that, about both the online forum and quarterly calls, so that we can continue to stay connected. And then the final thing is that Erin's going to put in the chat a link to an evaluation form. We would love to have your feedback on today's showcase, so that we can take your input and put it to use when we're planning and organizing future state policy showcases. So I want to give our speakers today, Cindy, Doug, and Evan, a chance for any final words of wisdom, of anything they forgot to say that they would want to share with us as a wrap up today.
Yeah, I can start with nutrient reduction cannot be achieved through voluntary programs. So don't even try.
Thank you, Doug. Cindy or Evan?
I could just reiterate, yes, that's our struggle in Illinois. Our agriculture community has been really happy to well, it is what's brought ag to the table, because they realize if they don't make progress, that they will potentially be regulated.
I guess I would just conclude by saying that it takes a combination of innovative policies. I mean, Maryland has certainly had its fair share of very useful innovative policies, but also not forgetting about the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is a much more potent tool than most people realize. And you know, the bill that I presented on today was really designed to bring the Clean Water Act back, you know, give it its full effect here. And I think if that happens and the regulatory agencies are doing their job and doing what they're supposed to do, that I think that can really solve a lot of the problems.
Thank you so much, Evan. Cindy, Doug, Evan, thank you so much for being here today and sharing all of your wisdom and experience. And to all of you who joined us on the call, thank you for the work that you're doing and being part of the conversation today. And hopefully we'll all continue to stay connected going forward. So take care, have a good afternoon, and we'll be back in touch with you all very soon. Thanks, have a great afternoon.
Thank you.